Well, the rain, you guys away, and certainly our thoughts and prayers are also this morning with those of us who probably right about now are finishing the nationwide half marathon in the rain, which is not a very fun experience. But let me invite you to turn with me in your copy of God's Word to Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. If you're visiting with us this morning, let me catch you up a little bit. We have been in the Gospel of Matthew for quite a while. We tend to preach kind of passage by passage or verse by verse through books of the Bible. And at this point in Matthew 25, we are coming sort of to the end of what's called the Olivet Discourse in chapters 24 and 25. And that's where Jesus has been talking a lot about the end of time and his second coming back to the world, that his disciples would be ready for it. And so we come to this text this morning, having understood what he has been saying in recent weeks, especially last Sunday, but also looking forward to what is happening in the Gospel of Matthew. We are just 2 chapters away from Jesus having died, risen, and on his way to the Father. So we're coming very close to the end of this gospel. And as we come to this passage this morning, we want to continue hearing from Jesus about how we can be best ready for his second coming. You probably remember, if you were here last Sunday, that Jesus has been telling a series of stories, and the most recent story was the parable of the 10 virgins, or they're kind of function like bridesmaids. And that story was intended to remind his disciples who were hearing the Olivet Discourse of the importance of being ready for him to return, even though it's likely that his return will feel delayed. You remember there were 10 bridesmaids, and they were helping the bride while they waited for the groom. And according to the ceremony, the groom would come and all the bridesmaids would go out and meet him. And they would have torches, and they needed to ready themselves with oil for those torches, but then there was a delay. And all 10 of the bridesmaids fell asleep, and then when they were awakened to the fact that the groom had come, 5 of them realized that in the time of delay, their oil had burned away, and they didn't have any more oil for their lamps, so they had to run off and buy some. And then they were not ready for his return. That was a very sad story that kind of continues today, because Jesus is going to tell another parable this morning, and it's the parable of the talents. When Jesus comes to this parable, he's going to shift gears a little bit, coming off of the last verse from last Sunday, and we're going to get to think this morning about what do we do in the waiting. What should the Christian life consist of while we wait for him to return? Now, at the end of the parable of the virgins, Jesus says, "Therefore, be alert, because you don't know the day or hour when he will return." And so it's logical, makes sense that we would then want to know and consider, what do we do in the waiting? What should our lives be like? How can we invest our lives in God's kingdom? You know, this concept of waiting actually is pretty familiar to us. I would even take you there right now in your mind. I want to take you back to the waiting place, similar to where those 10 bridesmaids were, waiting on the groom to come. But even now, think about your daily life. Think about all the waiting that you do in the pickup line for kids at school, the doctor's office, waiting to finally reach the Kroger cashier so that you can check out. Did you know that one study found that the average person spends 168 minutes per week waiting? That means that in the average lifespan, 1 full year of your life is waiting. And it begs that important question. In all of those little moments of waiting, what do you do? Well, we all know what we do. As soon as there's a moment of waiting, out comes my phone. Because I can't be bored. I can't stand there in the line. I can't simply think about my life. I can't put that time to a better use. And so often I do find myself doing that very thing. But if we want to take our time, our lives, the investment of our lives seriously, we should consider what we do in the waiting. Think about even those little moments, those 168 minutes. You know that the average person can read comfortably about 200 words per minute. That means that in that time, if you were, and I'm not saying that we all should or you have to, but if you were to translate that time, transfer it into something else, away from the phone, away from the magazine, away from something mindless, into something important, even into something like opening that Bible app on the phone. Do you know that in the amount of time that you spend waiting in a lifetime, just using those few moments, you would read through the Bible 11 times? Many of us have not read through the Bible one time, but we could read through the Bible 11 times. That is just a clear daily reminder of how important and valuable our time can be, how important our lives are, and the kind of intentional focus that this passage brings to us in Jesus' words about what we do in the waiting. And what we're going to find this morning is that our Master has issued a call to us. And he has issued a call that we would be diligent in the waiting, that we would be diligent as Christians to invest our lives for his glory. Because we want, when he returns, we look forward to hearing those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master." We come to the story this morning, which is often known as the parable of the talents, and it's really aimed at Jesus' disciples as servants to consider what we do in that time of waiting. And I want to show you 3 truths that can help us to think more, maybe intentionally, more carefully about the Christian life in general. Here's the first. The first truth that Jesus intends to give to us through this parable is that our Master, just like the Master in the parable, our Master entrusts us with resources for his glory, resources that are intended to be invested until he returns again. In this parable, what we're going to find is that Jesus really illustrates the principle of life stewardship. The master, of course, in all of the parables represents God. In fact, in this one, it's quite easy to see a semblance of Christ because he is like a master who has gone on a journey. We'll see that in a moment. And of course, the servants in the parable symbolize his followers. And then the talents, as they're called, which we'll look more closely at that in just a moment, are really the resources and the responsibilities that have been entrusted to his servants. Notice what it says in verse 14. After telling them to be alert because they don't know the day or the hour, he says, "For it's just like a man about to go on a journey. He called his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. He says, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, depending on each one's ability. Then he went on a journey." Now, if we're going to understand this parable, I think what we must do first is we must get a sense of what exactly is this talent. In our English language, I think we lose a lot of the meaning that we find in this text of what Jesus intends to communicate because, you know, if we're honest, the way that you and I probably think about talents is we think about those little things that you're good at doing. Like some people have a talent for crossword puzzles, or some people have a talent for public speaking, or they have different gifts and different talents. And certainly that does ring true. And yet the problem is that often when we think of talents, we are thinking of the things God has entrusted to us as being much smaller than they actually are. What Jesus is talking about here when he talks about a man who has given talents or entrusted his possessions is that he has entrusted a life to you. He has given a life that has been redesigned by grace in order to be invested for his kingdom until he returns again. All the while, by his Spirit, he remains with you and working in you. I want you to notice what an incredible investment Christ has made in you. You know, one of the best ways I know to do this is to try to relate it to something that will be easy for us to understand. So I might relate it to you this way. Let's think about what Jesus is saying when he says that he entrusted talents. Now, a talent was a unit of measurement of currency. So when Jesus says talent, what his hearers would understand is that that was a 75-pound block of silver. That was an enormous investment, even just one talent, reflecting, of course, the spiritual gifts, the life-changing good news of the gospel that we have been given, even his ever joyful providence in our lives. And yet we must not underestimate the value of what he has given to each of us. 75 pounds of silver. Here's what a talent is at that time. It's 6,000 denarii. That's 6,000 days' wages. You may remember another parable that talked like this. It made the same kind of point about forgiveness. Do you remember the unforgiving servant who had amassed this enormous debt and his master forgave him, and then he went out and his fellow servant had a debt against him and he choked him and said, "Pay back what you owe"? The same kind of picture is being presented to show exactly the value of what Christ has done for you. In this case, what he has given to you. 6,000 days' wages. That's 20 years of wages. Now, let's do a little bit of math. I'm not great at math. You're welcome to check it. If I'm wrong, I don't care to hear about it. You'll get the point. But in 20 years of wages, think about it this way. Right now, everyone is in a different place, but on the average income today in, say, the city of Columbus is about $65,000. If you were to make $65,000 every year for 20 years, and that amounts to just one talent, that's $1.3 million. He called his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents. To one he gave 2 talents. To another he gave $1.3 million. The second servant, who received 2 talents then, has received $2.6 million, and the one with 5 has received $6.5 million. We have, just with that comparison, radically changed what you think of when you think about this text and this story. Because what Jesus has given you, even if you are like me, a one-talent guy, you have been given an enormous inheritance, an enormous responsibility. Who does this? Who does this? Who goes on a journey? Let's assume it's for 20 years. It's a long time. You don't give someone $6.5 million and come back tomorrow and say, "What did you do with my money?" Who does this? Well, of course, we know things about this man. Jesus is very clear. The whole Bible is clear about this man, this master, of what he is like. I will tell you the kind of person who does this. It is a person who is sovereign. You only do this if you are absolutely assured of control. This master divvied out all of his possessions going on a journey. And he does it with sovereignty. He also does it with wisdom. This person is wise. He knows what he is doing. He is not cast as a fool in the story. He is doing this with ultimate, complete, heavenly wisdom. Not only is he sovereign and wise, you've heard us say this before, he is sovereign, he is wise, and he is good. He is good in distributing his possessions to his people. This is with sovereign wisdom and goodness that Christ has, upon converting you, bringing you to himself by faith. He has given to you an enormous set of resources that he intends to work in you and for you to use until he returns again. But not only that, what we find about this master played out across this story and many others is that he is sovereign, he is wise, he is good, and he is happy. He does this happily. It is with joy that he gives away his possessions, that he brings his servants in to his very life. And he has entrusted to them something so incredible. Friends, this is your life. This parable is about your life. It is about what Christ has given to you. And so let me ask you, how does that change your vision for your life? It brings a very obvious question, doesn't it? What are you doing with your life? In the year 2000, not only was it Y2K, I got to experience that. That was pretty anticlimactic. We'd actually gone to a youth conference. This is the guy that I worked with, who is a great mentor of mine, Kevin Hall. That's what he decided to do on Y2K. Everybody was worried about the whole world falling apart and the computer shutting down. We took kids from Kentucky down to Florida to a giant conference in a stadium that was going to overlap the new year. That's what we did. Well, also what we did that year in 2000 is we went to another conference, which was called Passion One Day. It was in Memphis. It was this big conference with multiple stages out in a big field in Memphis. And if you know anything about this conference, you know that something happened at that conference that shaped an entire generation of Christians. I was there, but at that time, I was pretty unfamiliar with a pastor named John Piper. Therefore, it wasn't all that interesting to me to be at the stage at which he was preaching. So I think I was somewhere else. Sadly, though, I'm very happy now to know what I missed. I missed the seashell sermon. It is a sermon that, like I said, shaped a generation. If you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, you should immediately go home today and you should get on YouTube, or while you're waiting in line, get on YouTube and watch this sermon in its entirety. This is what John Piper did in part of the sermon. He pulls out a Reader's Digest article, and it's about a couple who took an early retirement. He says, Bob and Penny took early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years ago when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball, and collect seashells. He stopped in that moment. And this moment was the moment that an entire generation shifted in their outlook on life and whether or not they were wasting it. Because up until that moment, that sounded to the crowd like a perfectly fine thing to do. That's the American dream. You work hard, you amass some resources, you retire, and then you relax, you cruise. But the very next words out of his mouth turned the entire crowd upside down, silenced them. He simply said, "That's a tragedy. That's a tragedy." Then he imagined them standing before Christ on Judgment Day saying, "Lord, Lord, see my shell collection." He said to the crowd that day, and he said to me later, don't buy that dream. At the last chapter, before you stand before the Creator of the universe to give an account of what you did, here it is, Lord, my shell collection. And I've got a good swing, and look at my boat. And then he said, don't waste your life. Don't waste it. You only have one. Risk it all for the glory of Jesus Christ. That message and this parable has deeply affected me. It affects everyone in different ways. I'm not sure how it affects you. I can share a little of how it affects me. At least in one way, it has changed my relationship to time. I think very much about time. And actually, now that I'm a grandfather, at 48, I think even more about it. How has it affected me in some small ways? Every day, I have a timer on my watch. Right now it says 10 hours, 46 minutes, and 50 seconds. That's counting down until my bedtime. And that timer is always in front of me, reminding me of how many hours I have left until I will lay down and go to sleep and then repeat again. Throughout the day, I reset another timer over and over again for 25 minutes for focused attention on the task of the moment with a little 5-minute break and then back to 25 minutes. To some of you, that sounds very burdensome. For me, it is the delight of my life. It is the comfort of my life. It's the joy. I love almost nothing more than resetting the timer and then going to work. It's because this parable has changed my life. It raises the question, what are you doing? I'm not the example to follow, but this is the way it has changed me. It must in some way change you. Because our master has gone on a journey and he has entrusted us with enormous resources, some more than others. And one day he will return. As we use this first truth to provide some application to our lives, I would simply share this with you, a couple pro tips. As you look at this passage, you will find something that's easy to do, and I want to encourage you not to do it. Don't get distracted by wrangling and questioning, why did one get 5 and one only got 1? If you get caught up in that, if you get caught up in the difference between 5 talents and 2 and 1 and what that means to each person and how valuable your time or your life or your ability is because they were given out according to ability, you are wildly missing the point. It's just not about that. And the second pro tip I want to give you is this. Don't underestimate the value of a single talent. That's so easy to do, especially with our definition of talent. It sounds like, I just have 1 talent. At a minimum, you have received over $1 million spiritual dollars. And they have been entrusted to you that you might, with God's help, multiply them. You might grow your ability, that you might increase in a way, if possible, to increase the glory of your master upon his return. And certainly it is possible to increase your joy and the happiness that you will have when he returns again. You must know this first. Your master has entrusted you with resources for his glory, and those resources are significant. That brings us to a second truth that we must embrace this morning if we're going to make good use of this text. If we're going to answer the question, what am I going to do in the waiting? And this is the second. Everyone, because of what the master has done, because he has, with sovereignty and wisdom and goodness and happiness, entrusted to you his own possessions, everyone in this room has an unavoidable stewardship. The next part, just looking at verses 16 through 19, the next part of this parable highlights something very important for us. It highlights the motivation of the servants to actively engage with what has been entrusted to them. Notice what he says. These words are carefully chosen. He says in verse 16, immediately. Now, you might even notice something interesting. Depending upon your version of the Bible, the compiler or the editor that has placed the chapters and verses numbers in there, some of them have the word immediately at the end of verse 15 or at the beginning of verse 16 because there's a little overlap there. I think of the context, it makes most sense to think of immediately as being in reference to what the servants did. It says immediately. The man who had received 5 talents went and put them to work. And as a result, he earned 5 more. In the same way, the man with 2 earned 2 more. Notice what they did. Immediately, there's this language of urgency. There's this language of expectation and diligence. The first 2 servants immediately went to work. There is a sense in which they went joyfully to work. That's the kind of motivation. The master, as they have seen it, has entrusted to them something incredible, an incredible responsibility. And therefore, they go to work. For us, it is the translation from this earthly story into the heavenly story of what we should be doing as Christians in the waiting. We should be going to work. Not going to work at working to keep commands and to make sure that we stick to the program because everything depends upon that. It doesn't, right? Our eternal security depends upon Christ, but to go to work spiritually for his glory, to joyfully give our lives the way that he has. What did these servants do? They took risks. They put themselves out there. They poured themselves out. Why? Because they had an intentional motivation to multiply their master's wealth, to meet the master's expectations. And this is no small improvement. Think about what this means. The servant who had been given $6.5 million at the end of the journey, when he returns, let's say 20 years later, comes back, the master finds him having returned 13 million, 2.6 to 5.2 million. It's incredible. How did they do this? Well, at this time, the normal way that they would probably go at this is lending money out to others. They likely were trading goods and property, buying and reselling land, grain, olive oil, all of those kinds of things. But what they're doing is they are being entrepreneurial. The encouragement to us here, though it's an interesting shift of mindset, is that that's exactly what every Christian is to be. Spiritually entrepreneurial. What does that word mean, entrepreneurial? It means to undertake something. It's two words, under and take. It means to take action. It means to pour yourself into something. It means to go out and take a kind of risk, but it means to invest your life in something bigger than yourself. It speaks to exactly what he has given us. And if you don't rightly estimate what Christ has given to you in calling you to himself and entrusting you with his possessions, you will be lacking part of the motivation. You have to have a clear vision for this. Very much of this comes down to clear vision. That's why Jesus is teaching the story. Let's relate it again back to some of what I was saying earlier. Let's think about this in terms of monetary value. I went looking for some examples, and I found a couple that I think could be helpful. A company a few years ago named King Bee Vans purchased another company called Fluid Truck. This other company was worth between $6 and $10 million. So what they did was they went and they bought this company. Now, Fluid Truck is a fancy company. It has a fancy app. They have 5,000 vans that you can commercially purchase or rent right on the app to use in your business, etc. This is the equivalent of what the servant with 5 talents was given. He was given a business of 5,000 vans. Let me ask you, what would you do if that was given to you? How would that motivate you to see what an opportunity you have in glory to your master to put all of those resources to work? Now, this is where it gets tricky, because it doesn't seem as though many of us are 5-talent people. I certainly am not. But it's easy for us to think, well, I'm just a 1-talent guy. What have I been given? It seems so small compared to 5. 1.3 seems so small compared to 6.5. Can I really do anything with that? Well, do a little bit of the same math. Not far from here, right over on Bryce Road, is Scarborough Square. It's a shopping center. There are about 20 little shops in there. There's a tattoo parlor, there's a boxing ring, there are a number of other little shops and stores. That was purchased a couple of years ago for $1.5 million. I want you to translate that into your spiritual life, because if you are like me, a 1-talent person, that's what you've been given. It doesn't sound so paltry that way, does it? What would you do with those 20 stores? What would you do for your master's investment in order to multiply it to his glory? Because that's what you've been given. You and I have been given far more than we ever could imagine. And this is the vision that we must have. Without this vision, we are less capable of investing our lives. We need to see the ultimate value that he has given to us. But notice there are not only two servants in the text. There's someone else in verse 18. He does something very different than the first two. He's the one who received the 1 talent. It says in verse 18, the man who had received 1 talent went off. He went off the grid. He went out somewhere else. He went out into the country. What did he do? He dug a hole in the ground and he hid his master's money. And then after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. All three had an unavoidable stewardship, but only 2 were faithful stewards. 1 was not. It reminds us that there are 2 ways to live for Christ. You will either put your life into the world, or you will put it into the kingdom. At home recently, we have been talking about this in terms of personal responsibility in the path of your life, the difference between turning right and turning left. If you turn left, it leads to all kinds of problems and irresponsibilities. To turn left is to waste your life. To turn right is to invest your life. Every person has many turns in a lifetime. The servant with only 1 talent turned left. He chose to take what God had given him and bury it in the ground. Think about what that means. Think about your daily life. Because all of us are a kind of blend of the two, aren't we? Sometimes we really invest our lives in the kingdom, and sometimes we find ourselves getting caught up in all these other routines and the frivolous things that have been afforded to us because of the country that we live in or the income that we make. We love entertainment. Think if you were someone who had received the $6.5 million investment, that could, as it was worth here, worth a potential 13 because he doubles it. If you were to take that amount of money over the course of 20 years and take the average working week of being 40 hours, do you know how much that is? That's $325 an hour. I would encourage you to think about your time a little that way spiritually. Your time is worth that spiritually. It changes the way that we think about some of the things that we do. I know, I'm guilty. Easy target, scrolling, entertainment. It's easy for us to get caught up in those things, but think about it. What if every hour you spent scrolling, $325 dropped out of your bank account? You'd probably stop scrolling. It doesn't mean that we can't do those things. It doesn't mean that there's not a place for them. It's just a calling for us to think about our lives. Think about where your life is going. Think about where your time or your resources or your attention is going. Constant, conscious investment. Ask yourself this: are you consciously investing your life into God's kingdom? It doesn't mean that every single moment of every day has to be redlining the RPMs. No one can keep up with that. But it does mean that we need to at least become more conscious, to be more aware of what we're doing with our lives. That brings us to this last important truth. This is the hard one. Faithfulness leads to reward. But that also means that Jesus' point is that unfaithfulness does lead to loss, at least of some kind. This is a long little chunk here. Let's take it a few verses at a time, just verses 20 through 23. I want you to notice that the first 2 servants, as a result of their faithfulness, are said to enter into their master's joy. It says in verse 20, the man who had received 5 talents approached, presented 5 more talents, and said, "Master, you gave me 5 talents. See, I've earned 5 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy." The man with 2 talents also approached. He said, Master, you gave me 2 talents. See, I have earned 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Same result. Share your master's joy. But then we come to that other servant where something has gone wrong. It would be helpful to us if we could diagnose what went wrong, that we might avoid that kind of thing. In verse 24 and 25, we read this about him. The man who had received 1 talent also approached and said, Master, I know you. You are a harsh man, reaping where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid and went off and hid your talent in the ground. See? You have what is yours. He went out and dug it up and brought it back to him. Just that 75-pound silver bar. But then something tragic happens. And it happens for a reason. What do you notice about what this servant says about the master? Look at the way he speaks to him. Master, I know you. You are a rough man. You are an unjust man. You are a harsh man. You are a taker. You take when you haven't sown. You benefit when you haven't worked. You are impossible to please. Therefore, I was afraid of you. I was afraid of disappointing you. So I took what you entrusted to me and I buried it in the world. Here, you can have it back. It's a fascinating story with fascinating details and dynamics that help us in every way in our relationship with Christ. And we also have the opportunity to hear the master reply. Just as that servant made excuses and threw darts at the master's character, notice what his reply. In verse 26, his master replied to him, you evil, lazy servant. If in fact you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I haven't scattered, then you should have deposited my money with the bankers and I would have received my money back with interest when I returned. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. Take the investment that was his responsibility and entrust it to the one who has been faithful. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have more than enough. But from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And then he says in verse 30, throw this good-for-nothing servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, here's a place where you can go wrong in understanding this parable, I think. Jesus is not trying to give you a formula for how you get to heaven. That wouldn't make any sense. The Bible doesn't give us any sense that that's the way it works, right? That's not the gospel. Well, you didn't do enough for me, and therefore you're out. That's not what he's doing. He's not giving a formula of how you come to heaven, but he is teaching a principle about kingdom happiness, about what it is like to be a true follower of the master. This is the reality. If, in fact, that servant had been afraid, if he had been feeling overwhelming weakness and concern about what he would do and about the master's return, and if he had, by the master's own admission, simply deposited that money out of fear or weakness in the bank so that it would even just gain the most minimal interest, if he had just taken that step, the master would have been understanding. The master would have been merciful. The master would have been gracious. You see, the fate of this unbelieving servant in the story is in stark contrast with those who multiplied what was invested in them. His talent is taken and given away. But why? Why does this happen? Why does it happen to this servant? What has gone wrong? Why has he not responded like the other two? Because as we find here and in many of other Jesus parables, even the last one that we read about the 10 bridesmaids, Those 5 that didn't have oil when they arrived late and the door's already shut, do you know what he says to them? I don't know you. That's the same problem that's going on here. You can see it very clearly in the way he talks about the master. He doesn't know the master. Are any of these things true about the master? The master is the God of the Bible. The master is the Christ of the gospel. Are any of these things true? Is he a harsh man? Is he hard? Does he reap where he hasn't sown? Is he a taker and a taker? Is he unjust? No. What's the problem? The problem is the unfaithful servant did not invest the master's resources because he doesn't know the master. Why were the faithful servants so generous in their investment? Why did they immediately and seemingly joyfully go out and take all that's been given to them and spend their lives multiplying the master's fortune? Why did they do that? Because they know him. Because they know what he is like. They know that he is not harsh. He is gentle. They know that he is not unjust. He is generous. It is because they know him. This speaks in incredible ways to the important dynamic of knowing Christ. Why would a person not spend his life on Christ? Only if he didn't know him. Therefore, the more you know him, the more you will give your life away. I've had this experience. You've probably had this experience in just earthly ways. There are a series of men in my life who have been very similar to this master, and in at least those instances, I poured out my life for them. Why? Because I knew them. Kevin Hall, Max Apple, Dwayne Milioni, Robert Jones. Those are my 4. And I poured my life out for them. I wanted so badly to please them, not because I was afraid of them, but because I admired them. Because they weren't harsh to me, they were merciful. They weren't unjust to me, they were generous. All that they had invested in me gave me every motivation because I knew them to want to pour my life out. Here's the point. Here's the truth. If you have a wrong view of God, you will have a wrong use of your life. If you have a wrong view of God, you will waste your life. But if you have a right view of God, you will pour your life out in courageous stewardship. You'll take all kinds of risks, and you'll do it with a smile on your face because you know the master. That's why this is so important. I would encourage you to read a book. It can be a little challenging. There's a modern English version, but it's very important. It's been very impactful to my life. I would say it's probably one of the best, if not the best book written on the Christian life, on knowing Christ. It's called The Gospel Mystery of Sanctification. You've heard me talk about this before. You may have even heard me quote this little passage from it, even standing right here in the past. It's written by Walter Marshall, and in this one section that so stuck out to me, speaks to this very reality. I want you to hear these words. He says, you cannot love God if you are under the continual secret suspicion that he is really your enemy. You see, that's what went wrong with this other servant. That's why he buries the talent in the ground. It's because he's in a constant secret suspicion that this master is actually his enemy. He says you simply cannot love God unless you know and understand how much he loves you. And in the gospel, you can come to know God truly loves you through Christ. When you have this assurance, you can even love your enemies. The hardest thing to do, because you know that you are reconciled to God. You know that God's love will make people's hatred of you work together for your good. Don't miss this truth. That is exactly where he's sending the disciples and teaching them this parable. They're going to be hated by everyone. What is the parable of the talents intended to do? It is intended to grow such a joyful fire to pour out their lives, even in a world that hates them. And that is a testimony to how powerful it is when you know God. Because that's the difference between the servants. This is the key to true life stewardship. Hear those words. These are the words that we long to hear. These are the words that we will hear. And we will hear them because of Christ. If you know him, he has given you incredible resources for his kingdom, for his glory. He is coming again, all the while he is working to develop them in you and to activate your ability to be useful to him. It is all of grace. And because of that, in the end, you will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many. Share your master's joy." What a great place to end this morning. Because this is the hinge of the entire parable. This is at the center of the entire problem between the servants. It's those words, "your master's joy." That's the difference between the two. People who waste their lives, people who don't bring their lives to Christ, they don't, because they don't know the master's joy. They don't know the master is full of joy, that he desires to do all of these things for you because he loves you and he has welcomed you in, not just to be a servant, but to be a child. And this is the ultimate truth. Therefore, we want this morning for our response to be a diligent change, a change of vision, a change of energy, a change of outlook, because we long to hear those words. And I'll close with this. Friends, don't waste the one life you have. Don't waste your life on comfort and safety and trivial pursuits. Spend your life. Pour your life out for Christ's glory, for the good of others. Because that's what this parable is about, and that is what God intends for us to be doing in the waiting. Let me invite you to stand as you're able so that we can pray and thank God for this truth and submit ourselves to it by his grace. Our Father, this morning we come to you with a refreshed vision from your word. Our prayer is that you would take that vision and drive it even more firmly into our hearts, that we would see that you are our joyful master, that you are not harsh, you have not been hard, you are not unjust, you are not a Scrooge. You are generous to your people. You've invested in us things beyond our even recognition. We pray, God, please help us. Help us to follow this parable. Help us to read even this parable into all of the others. And help us to respond to you by giving our lives to you. I pray that if there's anyone here who does not know Christ, that this would be the day that they would come to the Master who is full of joy, who is sovereign, wise, good, and happy. That they would come to belong to him by faith in his Son and in what he has done for them. And I pray as a result that you would then invest in them your gospel resources, and that they would be set immediately on a path of joyful multiplication, a spiritual entrepreneurship, of giving their lives away for your glory in the waiting until you return. And we want to hear those words. Well done, good and faithful servant. Fill our lives with joy. Motivate us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.